Let's have a look at the Lasker-Pelikan variation of the Sicilian defense. So the Sicilian defense is e4, c5. White continues knight f3, and in a previous video on the dragon variation we saw this move d6, which is a very common move designed to prevent e5 from occurring and opening up the diagonal for the bishop. But there are many variations that first begin with the move knight to c6, including the variations we'll look at today. White can play the open Sicilian here with d4 offering the trade of pawns. Black can trade pawns. And now here black has an option of several moves to make. But knight to f6 is a strong move that attacks the e4 pawn and induces white to play knight to c3 to protect it and block his own c-pawn from advancing. And now the move e5 begins the Lasker-Pelikan variation. Very aggressive move, I would say somewhat controversial. It's an attacking move. It's immediately attacking white's knight in the center of the board and asking it where is it going to go. But it's controversial too. When black puts his pawn on e5, he's just abandoned the d6 and d5 squares. They can no longer ever be protected by a pawn again. So these are glaring holes in the black position. He can deal with the hole on d6 by pushing his pawn to that square, and then d6 would be guarded by both the bishop and the queen. But the hole on d5 sometimes lasts well into the middle game, if not the end game. And black needs some compensation for that deficiency in his position. Okay, but we will see in some of the variations why black might play like this. By the way, this is called the Lasker-Pelikan variation. I know it was named after Emanuel Lasker, the world champion, who employed it in a 1910 World Championship match against Schlechter. But some people call this move the Sveshnikov variation as well, because Sveshnikov developed a lot of theory in some of the lines that take place after that move. The Lichess database calls this the Lasker-Pelikan, and only one of the lines several moves later is named the Sveshnikov, and I'll mention that in a few moments. Okay, so now we're going to discuss what is white going to do with this knight. Well, it turns out the main move here is knight from d to b5. But before we look at that, let's look at the other possible knight moves which are deemed suboptimal. Okay, so let's review. So here is the Sicilian. Knight to c6 rather than d6 introduces us to many more variations. d4 offers a trade of pawns and begins the open Sicilian. Pawns get traded. Knight to f6 attacks e4. Knight c3 guards it. And now the Lasker-Pelikan move, e5. So other than moving the knight to b5, one place the knight might go to is b3. This is considered too passive, and black should play bishop to b4, and already black looks like he has a better position. He's better developed. He has 3 minor pieces out compared to white's 2 minor pieces. The knight on c3 is pinned, and the pawn on e4 is under attack. Also, black is threatening to get rid of his d5 weakness by playing the pawn to d5 now or very soon, on his next move or soon after. So what should white do in this position? Well, I think white does best to play dynamically and try to get counterplay and give up the e4 pawn, and either try to recover the e5 pawn or just get active piece play. But many players here would try to defend the e4 pawn which is currently under attack because the knight here is pinned. And the normal way to do it would be bishop to d3. Well, then black can play d5 immediately, and the holes on d6 and d5 are just wiped out, and black has already at least equalized in the position. The pawn is threatening to come forward and attack the pinned knight. It's threatening to take on e4 and attack the bishop. White's only move here is to take the pawn. Black can take back. And now the knight on c3 is under attack twice, so it needs defense. Bishop to d2 seems reasonable. But then black can trade on c3, beginning with the knight, and double white's pawns. White can opt to take back with the bishop, but then bishop takes c3 and b takes c3 would double the pawns anyway. So maybe white should keep the bishop on the board. Okay, the bishop can retreat to d6, and this is what black has gotten out of the position. He's given white the worst pawn structure here on the queen side. All right, so I would say black's opening has been a success. Black is definitely not like outright winning in the position. He might only have a very slight edge. White is doing fine. But white did not get any advantage, which he should have sought as soon as black played e5 because of those glaring holes in the position. So for those reasons, knight to b3 is not normally played in this position. It just gives black the opportunity to push d5 too soon and get a good position. Well, what about other moves with that knight? Knight to f5 seems possible, seems aggressive. It's aiming at this d6 square, this weakened d6 square. But here's the problem with knight to f5. d5 can follow immediately again. As soon as black plays d5 in the Lasker-Pelikan, he's probably equalizing. So he just unleashed an attack on the knight. And he's threatening this pawn on e4, which would undermine protection of the knight. He's threatening it twice, in fact. So white has little choice here. He needs to take the pawn on d5 and abandon his f knight, which black can take, and white recovers his piece on c6. Now black can consider trading queens here, and white can recover the queen with his knight. But then the knight could come to e3 and attack the bishop and protect c2. So I think it's a little bit more precise to simply take the pawn back. And now material is equal. And even though black has this isolated pawn, he solved the weaknesses that he created with the e5 move. He's slightly better developed. He has two minor pieces out. He already has this diagonal open. He's going to castle short. And this position should be fine. Okay, so I would say it's about equal. So again, for that reason, knight to f5 is not played in this position by top players. Another possible move is the move knight to f3. Well, this is passive, just like knight to b3 was, and it leads to similar positions. Black can pin that knight on c3 immediately, which does attack the e4 pawn. Okay, so white can guard it with bishop to d3, but then black can immediately take on c3 and saddle white with those doubled c pawns. And after that he can play d5 and get rid of his holes. E takes d5, and even queen takes d5 is a good recapture here, and the queen is strong in the center of the board. White does have the bishop pair here, so he has some compensation for his structural weakness on the queen side, but the position is about equal. Okay. And one last knight move we'll look at before the main move, going back after this Lasker-Pelikan move e5, is the move knight from d to e2, which is also passive, but white intends to transfer that knight over to the g3 square. So let's see how this might play out. This time black normally will develop his bishop to c5 rather than b4. The reason he doesn't move it to b4 It's because the knight on e2 is guarding the knight on c3, so he doesn't have the prospects of doubling the pawns. White can recapture with a knight, and from b4 the bishop can be harassed with a3. So he puts it on c5, and then white might respond with knight to g3. That was the plan of movement for that knight. Queen to b6 is powerful here, attacking the f2 square, also putting pressure on b2, keeping this bishop on c1 at home. White has to protect that square. One way to do it is queen to d2. But then knight to g4 puts even more pressure on that square. And white does have some options here of counterattacking, or he can try to guard f2 one more time. And it seems the only way to do it is knight to d1. And so black looks like he's quite aggressively placed in this position. So he's at least equalized, and I prefer black. So for that reason, knight to e2 is also not a very good move. So going back to this position after the variation starts with e5, that leaves knight d b5 as the only move we haven't considered. So let's take a look at that. Okay, so let's review the Sicilian defense, knight to c6, the open Sicilian, pawns get traded, knight to f6, attack c4, knight c3 guards it, and then this Lasker-Pelikan move, e5. Okay, so all grandmasters, I believe, or almost all grandmasters, unless maybe they're playing a blitz game, would play knight d to b5. It's the most challenging move to black's position. The point is it's hitting this d6 square, which is weak. Black almost invariably pushes his pawn to d6 so that it's protected twice here, filling in that hole. If he doesn't, something like this might happen. Turns out h6 is the second most popular move, but it's a very distant second. Black is struggling to find active moves in the position other than d6 and opening up his bishop, but h6 does prevent the bishop from coming to g5 and pinning the knight. So it is a possible try, but the problem is the knight would come into d6 with check. King really doesn't want to move to e7, so black is forced to trade on d6. And this position is certainly not a one position for white, but it's strategically better because black has these dark squared weaknesses due to this pawn pushing to e5, and he just traded his dark squared bishop. And white can take advantage of that. So black doesn't generally want to play like that. So backing up, that's why black pushes the pawn to d6. Now here white has a couple of main moves. I want to look at the move knight to d5. Okay, this move is allowing black to immediately deal with the problem of his hole on d5 because black can capture the knight, forcing white to fill in the hole with a pawn. So that hole can no longer be occupied by a piece. So that solves one of black's problems. But the reason white goes for this, and by the way, that forces knight takes knight because we have two knights attacking the c7 square, and so black doesn't have time to do anything else. So he's forced to take this knight, and the reason white goes for this and allows that hole to be filled in is because he has more space in the position. He has this pawn advanced all the way to d5 facing that pawn on d6. So black is cramped, that bishop has just been blocked in, and white has more space. And this can become a very positional game. Black needs to decide what to do with this knight now that it's attacked. There are two main moves here. By far the preferred move is actually knight to b8. Let's take a look at that. So knight to b8, and now you can play different ways. C4 seems to be the preference in the database. We'll continue with that. Point is to solidify your center and allow the knight to drop back to C3 behind the pawn once it gets attacked with A6. So black can continue to develop his kingside, bishop E7, bishop E2. Both players want to castle kingside, A6 to attack the knight, and it drops back to C3 as intended. So this is a typical structure the white side strives for in this variation. Black can play the aggressive move F5 in this position, and these pawns can become menacing. Anyway, I want to back up. After the move knight to B8, I mentioned that C4 seems to be the preference in the database. However, this position and this variation was played 3 times by Caruana versus Carlsen in their 2018 World Championship match. I think it was played actually 4 times, 1 time in the rapid tie breaks, but they played it 3 times in the classical time control. And 2 of those 3 games that reached, actually 3 games reached this position, and 2 of those 3 games saw Carlsen, who was black in all of those games, play knight to B8. And in both of those instances, Caruana actually preferred the move A4 rather than C4. His plan is to gain space on the queen side with this pawn, maybe even push it to A5 or A6, and drop the knight behind the A pawn rather than behind the C pawn. And he wants this knight to come over to C4. I'll show you how one of their 2 classical games in this position in that World Championship proceeded. We'll go down a little bit of this game. Bishop to E7, bishop E2, both players castled kingside, knight to D7. So that's why the black players put the knight on B8. They want to redeploy it to D7. Bishop to D2, F5. The black pawns begin to push. A5 gaining more space on the queen side. A6 attacking the knight, which Caruana pulled back to A3, eyeing the C4 square. Now Carlsen plays E4. Excellent move, because not only does that expand and gain more space and become a threatening pawn push against these pieces, but it opens a square for his knight on E5. So play continued knight to C4, knight to E5, knight to B6. So look at Carlsen's little knight dance there. Once it got attacked on C6, he was thinking about putting it on E5. Not something I would have thought about in this position. Once my knight is attacked, I wouldn't be able to conceive of such a long-term plan. Or maybe I would. I would like to think I'd be able to, but I probably wouldn't. Where would this knight go? I would be telling myself, well, which of these open squares is it going to end up on, and what path should I take? Carlsen is saying, no, it's going to belong right there, guarded by the D6 pawn. And he's going to have to push that pawn to do it. So his path is knight here, here, and then there. Meanwhile, what did Caruana do with his knight? Well, he dropped it back here, here, and then he firmly posted it on B6. So both players did an excellent job deploying their knights. Anyway, to review, this is the Sicilian. This is an open Sicilian, knight to F6, knight to C3. E5 is the Lasker-Pelikan variation. Knight DB5 is the preferred square for that knight, which is eyeing the weak D6 square. So black fills in that D6 hole by pushing his pawn. And white can play, it's not the only move, but he can play his knight to D5, attacking the C7 square. Black is forced to trade, becomes a positional maneuvering game. The knight usually drops back to b8. Although in one of the 3 games that reached this position in the World Championships, Carlsen dropped his knight back to e7, and it headed for the g6 square. And I think he actually did that in one of the rapid tie-break games as well and won. Okay, so the last thing I want to talk about is something called the Sveshnikov variation in the Lasker-Pelikan. Let's have a look. So from the beginning, here is the Sicilian, here's the open Sicilian, and e5 is the Lasker-Pelikan variation. And again, some people call that move immediately the Sveshnikov. The Lichess database doesn't call it the Sveshnikov yet, and I think the Lichess database does a very good job with their naming of openings. There has been a dispute as to who should get credit for this opening, since several strong players have developed a lot of the theory. But Sveshnikov really developed his theory along one particular line, and we haven't reached the line yet where Sveshnikov made his contributions. So this is called the Lasker-Pelikan variation until we get to Sveshnikov's contribution. So here's how the Sveshnikov goes. The knight goes to b5. Black plugs in that hole. But this time in the Sveshnikov, white does not allow black to fill in the hole here and play positionally. Rather, in the Sveshnikov, the point is to try to make use of this hole, keep it a weakness, and plant a piece on d5. So the typical move here is bishop to g5 to pin the knight so it's no longer controlling the d5 square. Then a6 is a normal move, and this is how black gets their counterplay. You may wonder this whole time, why is black creating this weakness in this opening? Well, one of the main reasons is because this knight on b5 is being kicked back to this awful square a3. Okay, and also black follows it up with b5, stealing the c4 square away from that knight. So that knight is miserable over there on the edge of the board. Once b5 is pushed, this is where the Lichess database calls this the Sveshnikov. Okay, so black has a threat here. He's threatening to push the pawn again and fork the knights. White did just pin the knight, which was guarding d5. So white's best move here, or one of 2 best moves probably, is knight to d5. That's the main move I want to look at for now. We can investigate this in more detail in a specialized Sveshnikov video in the future. But another move in this position is to take the knight first and then occupy d5. But many white players occupy d5 now, getting out of that fork. Then bishop to e7 to protect the f6 knight and get ready to castle. And now that knight has been unpinned, so it is threatening to take this knight and fill in the hole, and it's also threatening the pawn on c4. So white takes it with the bishop, leaving the knight to occupy that weakened square. Black recaptures with his bishop, and now this knight needs to get into the game in a hurry, and its only prospects are to push this c-pawn. c3 is the usual move, allowing the knight to come back into the game via c2. Some players actually push that pawn all the way to c4. And there's a lot of theory in the Sveshnikov, and this hole on d5 persists for a long time in most games. And that's where the games revolve, around that square. All right, that is it for the Lasker-Pelikan, this introductory video. You can look in more detail at the Sveshnikov. You can look at those World Championship games and look deeper into this positional line with e takes d5. So there's a lot to investigate. Thanks for watching.